I have been asked to speak on Julian of Norwich, and we've begun this discussion with All Shall Be Well with its music. This is the manuscript written by a nun who's had to live in exile in France. She comes back in disguise to England, seeking to get this text published. She will be imprisoned in Winchester Castle and in great difficulty with the Anglican bishop, who speaks of her text that she has in her bag as being pernicious and incorrect for Church of England's misogyny. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about paleography, how to read manuscripts, and contemplative writings by women, especially by Julian, as, in a sense, a kind of forbidden activity. We're not meant to study theology. That was only for men. But in fact, our theology tended to be excellent. And paleography and codicology, I studied under Jean Preston at Princeton University, who had bought from a shoebox when she was director of the Huntington 2 Fra Angelico paintings. And I said, Julian, they are rather good. And she said, no, they're just Victorian fakes. Then they were discovered to be real and were bought by the museum and for over £1 million and so forth. And these are the two panels. And from what I learned from her, I was able to edit Julian and also publish limited editions, which I designed in William Morris type, continuing the tradition that these women had had of seeking to propagate their texts in the face of resistance. And I did have the advantage of excellent editors and publishers, including James Hogg, who had been a Carthusian monk and who then left and married and had a parrot whom he called Paula, etc. I also was working on the connection between religion and neuroscience, seeing inherent in our brains is this sense of sacredness. And here you see the figure of Christ at Mount Sinai in a Byzantine icon, where you actually see that one side of his face is merciful and the other is the just. And this corresponds to the right and the left hemisphere. And also we had a whole tradition of these contemplative theologians speaking about the circle in the center, Pseudo-Dionysius, and then Dante in the Vita Nova has love say, I am at the center of the circle, equidistant from all points, but you are not. And Julian saying, I saw God in a point. Auerbach describes how there were two different senses of time. In Greek, in Homer, when Eurycleus washing Odysseus' feet, time is collapsed. The memory of when he was a boy and wounded on a boar hunt is recalled by her seeing the scar on his leg, whereas Judaic time is linear and doesn't do these backflashes. But this was the sense in medieval Gothic art of the circle in the center. On the inside, you saw all the colors. On the outside, it's just gray. That's your left hemisphere. This was your right hemisphere. And you had a whole theology about, in Boethius and Cusanus, of the center being freedom and what was good and what was beautiful and what was true is God. And the further you get away from it into the realm of lies and bondage and ugliness is non-being. Sin is non-existent, etc. And then these are the manuscripts. I found this Norwich Castle manuscript, which I believe is hers. It's not the Showing of Love, it's a compilation of other texts. and it's fascinating and so forth. And I'll just go quickly through that. And then I think it was actually being composed by her for use by Sir Miles Stapleton's daughter, Emma, who was also an anchoress, as was she. These were women who dedicated their lives to the study of theology and prayer and were, in a sense, protected, but at the same time, very much controlled and imprisoned for it. And her father had this text, which seems to be influenced by her image of the bleeding Christ, with which she identifies, speaking of that body. These women's texts are very much centered on the body. Also in the Amherst manuscript, which is the oldest manuscript apart from the Norwich Castle one that we have, which is said to be written in 1413 while she's still alive, and which has her, I believe, her corrections to the text, is also the text of Marguerite Porete, who was burned at the stake in 1310 for her book, where she begins by saying, I, creature made of the Maker God, by me that the Maker has made of him this book. And it's also a treatise on mystical contemplation. And this is the text of the Amherst manuscript, beginning first with the editor saying there is a vision shared by the goodness of God to a devout woman, and then her voice, though I desired 3 graces by the gift of God. And here we see her speaking of St. Cecilia, and I believe this is because her spiritual director, Benedictine monk, both of them, I believe, of Jewish ancestry in Norwich, he was the cardinal, titular cardinal of the Church of St. Cecilia in Rome in Trastevere. And these are her corrections to the text. And then she meets with Marjorie Kemp, who comes from Lynn. And Marjorie writes about this in her book. She's actually illiterate and dictates it, whereas Julian is literate. And she is encouraged by Julian to do pilgrimages to the Holy Land and then to write her book as well. So we get, for the first time, women actually writing their autobiographies. And this is Marjorie Kemp's text written down later, a copy kept at Mount Grace Abbey. And then we have the Westminster Cathedral manuscript, which I discovered, which has the date 1368. It's actually later, it's Tudor, it's copying out her text. But she talks about the hazelnut in the palm of her hand and being told that it is all that is made, it is the entire cosmos collapsed into this. And this is replicating the vision that St. Gregory sees of St. Benedict, where the entire cosmos becomes one single ray of light. I think you remember that from Star Trek. There were aspects of that. And then we have the Paris manuscript. This is Elizabethan. It's written out when the nuns had to go into exile. Catholicism was forbidden in England by the Anglicans. And Mary Champney and Elizabeth Saunders and other Zion nuns very courageously returned to England in disguise, trying to propagate this text because they loved it so much. Because in it, Julian says that God is her mother. God is feminine as well as masculine, which is also true in Jewish thought. And here we have her vision of the hazelnut, which is in all of the manuscripts except Norwich Castle. And then we have later, there's a scandal with Zion Abbey that was founded by St. Birgitta, who also wrote a massive book, which these 2 women are in a sense copying. They have been given role models. And there's a scandal of an Elizabethan pirate who publishes a libelous book against this abbey, which is now in Lisbon, in Portugal, in exile. So the English families, like that of Thomas More, can no longer send their daughters there. So they refound another abbey in France, in Cambrai, which was actually in the lowlands. And they continue to treasure Julian. They still can't get her published. And they're writing out Julian's text in their little manuscripts. And then their spiritual director, Augustine Baker, encourages this. And next, there is Serenus Creasy, who also is looking after the nuns in Paris, who've escaped from the monks in Cambrai in order to preserve their library of contemplative writings. And he, for the first time in 1640, publishes Julian's Showing of Love. But these are the nuns copying out the text. And this actually is the most slovenly text. It's written in great haste by the mother foundress of the convent in Paris before she leaves, because she has to make the copy from the original copy. And she's the one who's most careful in the 17th century from a 14th century text. And she carefully replicates the spelling and so forth. And when she makes a mistake and does a modern form, she crosses it out and puts the medieval form. So she's like a splendid early English text editor. And they also wrote out these contemplative collections, which at the French Revolution got seized by the revolutionaries, and they were placed in the Mazarin library. The librarian sneered at them and said, "This is a superstitious monk's book," not realizing it was written by a woman. And there's Augustine Baker, that's my text. And then when they got back to England following the revolution, they were almost guillotined with the nuns at Compiègne. One of them wrote it all out again in hand to give to the Marchioness of Bath because she was protecting them. And so that was the genealogy of the manuscripts. These are the books I've been publishing on her, because I feel it's important that the presence of women in religion, we had in our bodies, and this is what Julian is replicating, the sense that she is meditating. We are meditating on her as we read her. She is meditating on Jesus in the womb of Mary. So in a sense, he is also within her womb and within your womb as you read the text. And this is a lovely painting by Antonio Messina of an Arab girl being the Virgin Mary. And you are the angel announcing to her, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. You are pregnant with God." And so this is other women in the book, Hildegard of Bingen, Centumilta Faenza, who's contemporary with Dante. She's illiterate, but she writes out gorgeous theology for her nuns to write down, and Christine de Pizan, and so forth, and Birgitta of Sweden. And these are women that I have been, in a sense, studying and copying, going on their pilgrimages, living their monastic life and sharing in that. And these are the Sisters of Zion Abbey, which is now ended by the bishops. The male bishops are ending all women's communities and getting rid of our libraries. And my job has been to try to save their texts. Because these were the descendants of people like Thomas More and so forth. And those are the relics that the English nuns brought back from the Compiègne nuns who had been guillotined. And this is ourselves in Ireland editing the text of Julian of Norwich. Sister Anna Maria Reynolds, Sister Rita Mary Bradley, and myself. And this icon was made for me by a Benedictine, an Orthodox monk. And also, Sister Anna Maria Reynolds had already edited the text during the war, looking at the microfilms of the manuscripts, which were then buried under the ground from the bombing, with looking at a word at a time on the microscope and typing it out, Hunt and Peck. And it's a brilliant edition. And then we collaborated on publishing it. So I wish to thank you for this opportunity to talk about women's voices, treble voices, amidst the bass voices of the men. Thank you. And stop share, and we'll end this.